Hello there, and thank you for joining us for this episode, recounting Benzion Netanyahu's epic work, The Founding Fathers of Zionism. History is rarely written by accident. It is written by those who understand that ideas, long ignored, ridiculed, or suppressed, eventually shape reality. Before the State of Israel was born, before armies marched and flags were raised, there were thinkers, men who stared directly at a hostile world and refused to look away. This is their story, as told by one of the most formidable Jewish historians of the 20th century, Benzion Netanyahu. Benzion Netanyahu was not a politician. He was not a general. He was something far more dangerous to illusions, a historian. Born in 1910 in Warsaw, raised in Jerusalem, and educated in Europe and the United States, Netanyahu dedicated his life to one central question. Why were the Jews always hated? And why did that hatred never disappear? Unlike many scholars of his era, he rejected comforting explanations. He did not believe anti-Semitism was merely social prejudice. He did not believe it could be solved through education or tolerance. He believed it was structural, recurring, and deadly. Benzion Netanyahu served as secretary to Ze'ev Jabotinsky, the most uncompromising realist of the Zionist movement. Like Jabotinsky, Netanyahu believed Jewish history could not be understood through optimism. It had to be understood through power, vulnerability, and survival. Later, as a professor emeritus at Cornell University, he became renowned for his monumental work on the Spanish Inquisition, arguing that anti-Semitism was not a medieval accident, but a modern phenomenon rooted in identity hatred. This worldview shaped his interpretation of Zionism. In the Founding Fathers of Zionism, Benzion Netanyahu set out to correct what he believed was a dangerous distortion. Zionism, he argued, was not born from utopian dreams. It was born from failure. The failure of emancipation, the failure of assimilation, the failure of Europe. Each figure he examines arrived at Zionism reluctantly, often painfully, driven there by anti-Semitism, not ideology. 19th century Europe promised Jews equality. What it delivered was disappointment. Jews were emancipated in law, but rejected in society. They entered universities, only to be excluded from professions. They embraced national cultures, only to be branded eternal outsiders. Anti-Semitism evolved. It became racial, scientific, political, and it left Jews with one terrifying realization. No matter what they did, they would never be accepted. All five men examined by Netanyahu, Leo Pinsker, Max Nordau, Theodor Herzl, Israel Zangwill, and Ze'ev Jabotinsky, reached the same conclusion independently. The Jewish people needed their own state. None of them lived to see May 14th, 1948. None witnessed Jewish sovereignty restored. But without them, there would have been no state to declare. They forged the intellectual weapons before the political battle began. First, we begin with Leo Pinsker and the failure of emancipation. In the early 19th century, a new promise was made to the Jews of Europe. It was called emancipation. The old ghettos would be dismantled, legal restrictions lifted, citizenship extended. For the first time in centuries, Jews were told they could finally belong. Many believed it. Few believed it more deeply than a Russian Jewish physician named Leo Pinsker. Leo Pinsker was born in 1821 in the Russian Empire, in what is today Ukraine. He was educated, cultured, and thoroughly European in outlook. He believed in science, in progress, in reason. Pinsker did not see himself as a nationalist revolutionary. He saw himself as a reformer. If Jews abandoned separateness, he believed if they adopted the language, customs, and loyalties of their host nations. Then anti-Semitism would fade away. This was the dream of emancipation. For a time, the dream seemed plausible. Jews entered universities. They became doctors, lawyers, journalists. They participated in civic life, but acceptance proved shallow. Jews could be educated, yet not trusted, successful, yet resented, visible, yet never secure. Anti-Semitism did not disappear. It adapted. By the mid-19th century, hatred of Jews took on a new form, no longer purely religious, no longer medieval. It became racial, political, scientific. Jews were accused of being rootless, disloyal, and alien to the nation. Even converts were not spared. For the first time, hatred followed Jews, regardless of belief or behavior. This was a revelation that shattered Pinsker's worldview. The decisive moment came in the 1870s and 1880s. Across the Russian Empire, pogroms erupted. Waves of violence against Jewish communities. Homes burned. Families murdered. Authorities looked away. Pinsker watched the same society that promised equality unleash barbarism. The lesson was unmistakable. Jews were not hated because they were different. They were hated because they were Jews. In 1882, Pinsker published a short pamphlet that would echo through Jewish history. Its title was Auto-Emancipation. The argument was devastatingly simple. Pinsker wrote that Jews were viewed as a ghost people, a nation without land, without power, without normal political existence. And because they were abnormal, they inspired fear. Anti-Semitism, he argued, was not a misunderstanding. It was a psychological reaction to Jewish statelessness. Pinsker reached a conclusion that shocked many of his peers. The Jewish problem could not be solved by reforms. It could only be solved by normalization. And normalization required territory, political independence, and national dignity. In other words, self-determination. This was not yet political Zionism as later defined by Herzl, but it was the intellectual breach in the wall of assimilation. Benzion Netanyahu saw Pinsker as the first modern Zionist realist, not a dreamer, not a romantic, a man dragged into nationalism by historical failure. Pinsker did not seek separation. Separation was forced upon him. And this, Netanyahu argues, is crucial. Zionism was not born from arrogance. It was born from despair and clarity. Pinsker proved something irreversible, that Jews could do everything right and still be hated. That progress would not protect them. That enlightenment did not cure anti-Semitism. He reframed the Jewish condition as a political problem, requiring a political solution. Every Zionist thinker who followed stood on this foundation. Leo Pinsker died in 1891. He never saw the first Zionist Congress, never saw political Zionism take shape, never saw the state whose necessity he proved. But without him, there would have been no Herzl. Pinsker diagnosed the disease. The next figure would attack it with moral fury. A man who believed Jewish weakness had become a cultural crisis. A man who demanded Jewish pride as a form of resistance. His name was Max Nordau. By the end of the 19th century, Jewish suffering had taken on a new and more dangerous form. It was no longer only external, it was internal. Jews were not merely persecuted by others. They were beginning to doubt themselves. No one understood this danger more clearly than Max Nordau. Max Nordau was born in 1849 in Pest, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was everything the emancipated Jew aspired to be: a physician, a philosopher, a literary critic, a cosmopolitan intellectual, fluent in the languages and ideas of Europe. Nordau did not grow up dreaming of nationalism. He believed in universalism, in progress, in the moral advancement of humanity. Like Pinsker before him, he assumed that reason would eventually dissolve hatred. He was wrong. Nordau lived at the heart of European civilization and watched it decay from within. Nationalism hardened, racial theories spread, anti-Semitism became fashionable among elites. Jews were caricatured as weak, degenerate, and parasitic. These accusations were no longer shouted only by mobs. They were written in books, taught in universities, published in respectable journals. For Nordau, this was not simply an attack on Jews, it was an attack on truth. In 1892, Nordau published his most famous work, Degeneration. It was a sweeping critique of European cultural decline. He argued that what passed for sophistication was actually moral and psychological collapse. Decadence masquerading as enlightenment, cynicism mistaken for intelligence. And in this collapsing culture, Jews were blamed for everything. Nordau recognized a terrifying pattern. When societies lose confidence in themselves, they look for scapegoats, and Jews had always been the most convenient. Nordau believed anti-Semitism did more than harm Jews physically. It deformed them psychologically. Centuries of persecution had produced a tragic phenomenon. Jews internalized the contempt of their enemies. They learned to apologize for existing, to shrink themselves, to believe they were weak. Nordau called this Jewish self-contempt, and he considered it fatal. Nordau did not arrive at Zionism through romance. He arrived through rage. He believed Jews needed not only safety, but dignity, and dignity required a radical transformation. No more pleading, no more disguising identity, no more begging for acceptance. Jews, he argued, must stand upright in history again. Nordau found his political counterpart in Theodor Herzl. Where Herzl provided political structure, Nordau provided moral fire. Together, they transformed Zionism from scattered yearning into organized movement. At the first Zionist Congress in 1897, it was Nordau who electrified the room. He spoke not of dreams, but of necessity. Nordau introduced one of the most provocative concepts in Zionist thought: muscle Judaism. This was not about physical fitness alone. It was symbolic, a rejection of the stereotype of Jewish weakness, a declaration that Jews would no longer accept humiliation as destiny. Nordau believed Jewish survival depended on restoring pride, psychological, cultural, and physical. Without it, no political solution would endure. Benzion Netanyahu viewed Nordau as essential to Zionism's success. Pinsker diagnosed the political illness. Nordau diagnosed the spiritual damage. Netanyahu argued that without Nordau's revolt against self-contempt, Zionism would have collapsed into apologetics. Zionism required moral confidence. Nordau supplied it. Nordau forced Jews to confront an uncomfortable truth. Assimilation had not made them safer. It had made them invisible, and invisibility invited contempt. Zionism, therefore, was not extremism, it was self-respect. Max Nordau died in 1923. He did not live to see Jewish sovereignty restored, but he lived long enough to know that Jewish history had changed direction. The Jews were no longer waiting, they were organizing. Nordau awakened Jewish pride. The next man would channel that pride into political action on the world stage. A journalist who watched anti-Semitism shatter every illusion. A man who understood that the Jewish problem was not cultural but political. His name was Theodor Herzl. Zionism did not begin in the shtetl. It did not begin in the synagogue. It began in the salons and newsrooms of Europe, among men who believed they were finally safe. No one embodied that illusion more completely than Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl was born in 1860 in Budapest into a cultured, assimilated Jewish family. He spoke German. He dressed impeccably. He believed deeply in European civilization. Herzl did not grow up dreaming of Jewish nationalism. On the contrary, he believed Jews should dissolve into the societies around them. Judaism to him was a private matter. Nationality belonged to the modern state. Like so many of his generation, Herzl believed history had moved on. Herzl's awakening did not come from theology. It came from politics. As a journalist in Paris, Herzl covered one of the most infamous events of modern European history, the Dreyfus Affair. A Jewish officer, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, was falsely accused of treason. The evidence was fabricated. The trial was rigged. The verdict was predetermined. And the streets of Paris filled with a chant that shattered Herzl's faith in Europe. Death to the Jews. This was not Russia, not Eastern Europe. This was France, the cradle of enlightenment. Herzl understood the meaning immediately. If Jews could be scapegoated in France, if assimilation could not protect a decorated officer, then nothing protected the Jews. Anti-Semitism was not an accident. It was a political force, and politics required a political solution. In 1896, Herzl published a short book that changed Jewish history, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. The argument was blunt. The Jewish problem was not religious, it was not social, it was national. Jews were a people without a state, and therefore at the mercy of every other people. Only sovereignty could solve that condition. Herzl did not speak of waiting. He spoke of organization. He believed Jews must act like a nation before they were treated like one. Diplomacy, institutions, international legitimacy. Herzl transformed Zionism from a scattered idea into a political movement, and he did it with breathtaking speed. In 1897, Herzl convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. For the first time in 2,000 years, Jews gathered openly to discuss statehood. Not charity, not tolerance, but sovereignty. Herzl famously wrote in his diary, "In Basel, I founded the Jewish state." He added quietly, "If not in 5 years, then in 50. He was almost exactly right. Benzion Netanyahu admired Herzl, but with precision, not sentimentality. He viewed Herzl as a political genius, not a prophet. Herzl understood that anti-Semitism was permanent. But Netanyahu also saw Herzl's limitations. Herzl believed diplomacy could persuade the world. History would prove that persuasion alone was not enough. Herzl worked relentlessly. He met emperors, kings, sultans. He negotiated with Britain, the Ottoman Empire, and world powers. But the burden was immense. Zionism faced opposition from anti-Semites, assimilationists, Orthodox Jews, and socialists. Herzl carried the entire movement on his shoulders. Theodor Herzl died in 1904. He was 44 years old, exhausted, worn down, still fighting. He did not live to see the Balfour Declaration, or the Mandate, or the State of Israel. But he left behind something irreversible, a political framework for Jewish sovereignty. Herzl proved that Jewish suffering could be transformed into political action. He turned despair into strategy. Zionism, after Herzl, was no longer a theory. It was a movement with institutions, leadership, and direction. Yet Herzl left behind an unresolved question. Where should the Jewish state be? And what happens when reality does not cooperate with idealism? The next figure would wrestle with that tragedy, a writer torn between compassion and necessity. a man whose vision revealed both the power and the pain of Zionism. His name was Israel Zangwill. Zionism did not move forward in a straight line. It advanced through arguments, through doubts, through moral anguish. No figure captured this inner struggle more vividly than Israel Zangwill. He was not a politician, not a general, not even a theorist in the strict sense. He was a storyteller, and what he told was the story of a people with nowhere to go. Israel Zangwill was born in London in 1864 to parents who had fled Eastern European persecution. Unlike Herzl, Zangwill grew up immersed in Jewish poverty, anxiety, and displacement. He knew the ghetto, not as an abstraction, but as lived reality. Zangwill became famous as a writer and playwright, celebrated in English literary circles. Yet beneath his success was a persistent obsession. Why were Jews everywhere and at home nowhere? Zangwill understood something that many Western Jews resisted. Anti-Semitism was not confined to backward societies. It thrived in modern ones. Britain, France, Germany, each promised tolerance. Each eventually withdrew it. Zangwill watched pogroms in Eastern Europe and polite exclusion in the West, and concluded they were different expressions of the same disease. Zangwill initially embraced Zionism under Herzl's leadership. He supported Jewish national revival and believed sovereignty was the only durable solution. But he was also painfully realistic. Palestine was small, underdeveloped, politically constrained, and millions of Jews were in immediate danger. This led Zangwill to a deeply controversial position. Zangwill became the leading advocate of territorialism, the idea that Jewish survival mattered more than any specific location. If Palestine was unavailable, he argued, then Jews must settle somewhere: Africa, South America, anywhere safety could be secured. This was not abandonment of Zionism. It was desperation. Zangwill is often misquoted, oversimplified, or caricatured. His famous phrase, "A land without a people, for a people without a land," was not denial of Arab existence. It was an expression of Jewish homelessness. Benzion Netanyahu emphasizes this distinction strongly. Zangwill's tragedy was not arrogance, it was urgency. As Zionism increasingly committed itself exclusively to Palestine, Zangwill broke away. He feared that ideological purity would cost lives. Others feared that abandoning Palestine would destroy the movement's soul. This conflict revealed a painful truth. Zionism was not only about land, it was about time. Benzion Netanyahu treats Zangwill with sympathy, but firmness. He argues that Zangwill misunderstood one crucial fact. Only historic connection could mobilize Jews at scale. Palestine was not interchangeable. It was memory, identity, continuity. Without it, Jewish nationalism would dissolve into philanthropy. Israel Zangwill died in 1926. He did not live to see the Holocaust. Had he lived longer, his urgency might have seemed prophetic. But history chose another path. Zionism survived not because it compromised, but because it endured. Zangwill represents the moral cost of Jewish history, the unbearable weight of choosing who can be saved now versus what must be preserved forever. He reminds us that Zionism was never simple. It was tragic, necessary, and human. Zangwill wrestled with doubt. The final figure embraced certainty. A man who believed Jewish survival required strength, not apologies. A man who rejected compromise with hatred. His name was Ze'ev Jabotinsky. Zionism began with diagnosis. It matured through moral revolt. It organized through politics, but it hardened into realism through one man, a man who believed that Jewish history had taught a single, unforgiving lesson. A people that cannot defend itself will not be defended by others. His name was Zeev Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was born in 1880 in Odessa, a cosmopolitan port city of the Russian Empire. He was brilliant, charismatic, and multilingual. A journalist, poet, translator, and public intellectual. He could have lived comfortably within European culture. But Odessa was also a city of pogroms, of sudden violence, of mobs unleashed while authorities looked away. From an early age, Jabotinsky understood something his predecessors had only gradually discovered. Modernity did not cure anti-Semitism. It perfected it. The defining moment came in 1903 with the Kishinev pogrom. The brutality stunned the Jewish world. Homes destroyed, families murdered, the state complicit through inaction. For Jabotinsky, Kishinev was not an aberration. It was a warning. He concluded that Jewish survival required not sympathy, but force. Unlike Herzl, Jabotinsky did not believe diplomacy could precede power. Unlike Zangwill, he did not believe compromise could save lives. And unlike Pinsker or Nordau, he believed time was running out. Jabotinsky insisted that Jews must learn to fight, not as mobs, not as victims, but as a disciplined national force. This belief would change Zionism forever. During World War I, Jabotinsky helped form the Jewish Legion within the British Army. For the first time in modern history, Jews fought openly as Jews, under a Jewish banner, with rifles in their hands. For Jabotinsky, this was not merely military service, it was psychological revolution. The Jew as soldier, the Jew as defender. After the war, Jabotinsky broke decisively with mainstream Zionist leadership. He demanded immediate Jewish statehood, mass immigration, and military preparedness, and rejected reliance on imperial goodwill. This philosophy became known as revisionist Zionism. It was uncompromising and deeply controversial. It was uncompromising and deeply controversial. In 1923, Jabotinsky published his most famous and misunderstood essay, The Iron Wall. Its argument was unsentimental and brutally honest. No people, he wrote, voluntarily accepts displacement. Arab opposition to Zionism was therefore inevitable, not immoral, but human. Peace could come only after Jewish strength was undeniable. Strength first, negotiation later. This idea would shape Israel's security doctrine for generations. In the 1930s, as Europe darkened, Jabotinsky issued desperate warnings. He urged Jews to leave Europe immediately, in massive numbers, not as ideology, as rescue. Most did not listen. They trusted civilization, law, progress. History would judge that trust mercilessly. Benzion Netanyahu was not merely Jabotinsky's historian, he was his disciple. As Jabotinsky's secretary and ideological heir, Netanyahu absorbed his realism completely. He believed Jabotinsky saw what others refused to see, that anti-Semitism was permanent, that weakness invited catastrophe, that Jewish survival required sovereignty backed by force. This worldview would later shape an entire political tradition in Israel. Zeev Jabotinsky died in 1940. He did not live to see the Holocaust, but he did not need to. He had already predicted it. And he did not live to see the state of Israel, but his ideas would help build it. When Israel declared independence on May 14, 1948, it did so in war, surrounded, outnumbered, under attack, yet it survived, not because the world allowed it, but because Jews fought back. The Iron Wall stood. Pinsker diagnosed the political illness. Nordau restored Jewish pride. Herzl built the political framework. Zangwill exposed the tragedy of homelessness. Jabotinsky answered the final question: How does a Jewish state survive in a hostile world? With strength, with clarity, with resolve. All 5 men passed from the scene before the moment arrived. They never heard David Ben-Gurion read the declaration. They never saw the flag raised. But without them, there would have been no state to declare. In our final section, we return to that moment, May 14th, 1948, and the fulfillment of ideas born in persecution. On May 14th, 1948, as the British Mandate came to an end, a declaration was read in Tel Aviv. It was brief, measured, legalistic, but behind those words stood generations of failure, suffering, and clarity. And behind that clarity stood 5 men. They did not live to see this moment, but they made it inevitable. The State of Israel was not granted, it was asserted. Within hours of its declaration, it was invaded by neighboring armies. No guarantees, no grace period, no sympathy, only war. This was the world Benzion Netanyahu understood and never romanticized. Israel was born not into peace, but into reality. And it survived because it was prepared for that reality. Benzion Netanyahu rejected the idea that Zionism was a dream fulfilled. He argued it was a necessity realized. The Founding Fathers of Zionism were not prophets of hope. They were diagnosticians of catastrophe. Each reached Zionism not because they wanted it, but because everything else failed. Leo Pinsker proved emancipation was an illusion. Max Nordau exposed the psychological damage of powerlessness. Theodor Herzl transformed despair into political action. Israel Zangwill revealed the tragic urgency of Jewish homelessness. Ze'ev Jabotinsky insisted that survival required strength. Different temperaments, different methods. One conclusion: the Jewish people could not survive history without sovereignty. Benzion Netanyahu's most controversial insight was also his most enduring. Anti-Semitism was not an accident of backward societies. It was a recurring feature of civilization itself. It adapted, it modernized, it justified itself with new languages. And every time Jews believed it had finally disappeared, history corrected them. Zionism was not a rejection of the world. It was a refusal to be destroyed by it. May 14th, 1948, did not solve anti-Semitism. It changed something more fundamental. For the first time in 2,000 years, Jews were no longer dependent on the goodwill of others for survival. They could defend themselves, decide for themselves, fight for themselves. This was the true revolution. Benzion Netanyahu did not write history to comfort. He wrote it to warn. He believed Jewish sovereignty was not the end of the story, but the beginning of responsibility. A Jewish state would be judged not by its intentions, but by its ability to survive in a hostile world. That survival, he believed, would always require clarity, strength, and realism. Today, the State of Israel stands as living proof of an idea once dismissed as impossible. It is imperfect, contested, under constant scrutiny, but it exists, and existence, for a people nearly erased, is not trivial. It is historic. The Founding Fathers of Zionism did not live to see the flag raised, but they saw something else just as important. They saw the truth that Jewish history could not continue as tragedy without end. That dignity required sovereignty, and that survival was not a crime. It was a right. On May 14th, 1948, that right was reclaimed, and history was forced, at last, to make room for the Jewish people again. Thank you for listening.